it doesn't, even though we're dealing with a metaphysics and we're dealing like with a quantum physics and you need an equation, the equation doesn't have to come today. But the cards have to go on the table today so that we understand it, and maybe time will let us know whether it works or doesn't work.
Well, perhaps the discrepancy between our notion of chronological time and a divine, perhaps, concept of time is yet another time issue that makes it perhaps impossible to ever really come to a definitive conclusion.
This is true. I'd just like to say that I feel that a metaphysics has to be viable at the moment in time you present it, has to be viable 100 years from now, has to be viable 1,000 years from now. That's number one. That's addressing your point. As far as your point, we are all aware of that. We do not know the boundaries of time. We do not know the dimensions of time. We can only deal with time as best as we know it, and to assume it's relatively as we experience it. That's the best we can do in contemporary times. This is a metaphysics proposed for contemporary times, and that's how we're dealing with it. We're presuming that we're rational, logical, what we see is what we see, what we feel is what we feel. That we feel pain is pain, we think we see evil, it seems to be in the realm of evil. So we're getting away from all that semantic discussion, which you find in academia, where nothing is real. No, we're saying everything, let's assume everything is real. That we are real,
No, I'm not disagreeing. I
right.
think our perspective of time is real insofar as we have a concept of time.
Fair
but
enough.
then there is yet another dimension of time.
We're aware of that, that's the next book. We're aware of that.
I think one other thing that Rabbi Tokayer is saying, however, is that you can't have instant gratification. We're not going to know. You're asking the fundamental question, does this make sense? Is it internally consistent? Does it have this elegance? We may conclude yes, we may conclude no.
Right.
The only way we're really going to know is to see how it's ex post facto validated.
No question about it.
Maimonides is considered
Right.
definitive, not because in his own time he was necessarily
Right.
considered definitive,
Right.
but because over the long term, both his philosophical writings, his halachic writings, his
Right.
other writings have quote unquote
Right.
stood the test of time.
Right.
Past the test of
Past
time.
the test of time.
No question about it, and we're all in agreement on that. And we're not here to say today, this is genius, brilliant, this is the solution. We're here to discuss, how does it feel? What parts of it seem to feel good? Does it seem to be internally elegant? Or does it seem to be a gaping hole in it? I think it's the maximum we can attempt, in a discussion like this.
I think there's no hole. I think that you jumped into the ocean, easy to drown. You swam through it. You did your homework, went through all your predecessors, gave their strengths as well as the weakness in each, try to produce a unified theory. This is Newton, this is Einstein,
Right.
maybe now it's a Birnbaum. But try to have a unified theory that is relevant, that is acceptable to the scientific world, to the philosophical world, fair to God, fair to human being, and can enhance a human being, and maybe prevent another Auschwitz.
Now, one of the purposes of writing this is that I felt it would both elevate, frankly, the Jews in particular, and I felt the world at large. I felt the underlying theme that quest for potential drives the divine and the cosmos is a very energizing, uplifting theme. Universal and somewhat hard to argue with, especially if it's a core divine dynamic. And it basically says that, the poverty-stricken person born in Bangladesh achieves his potential if he advances as much as he can with his family his lifetime, in parallel to the person born into a privileged home in Paris, is on equal footing with that person, only if he achieves his potential from his starting point. So potential is relative.
Everyone has the potential.
Right.
And you deal with intellectual potential. There's all types of potential. And if the human being can fulfill his potential, God can also fulfill his potential. So there you find the unified theory of of a philosophy of life, of a way to live that makes sense,
Right.
that's spiritual, that's
Right.
intellectual,
Right.
and satisfying to the human being and satisfying to the divine. There's a divine potential and there's a human potential.
I didn't quite, maybe I didn't grasp it, but I was troubled a bit by that concept. Are you saying that because there's a divine potential that there is an ever-evolving divinity, or that there is a yet fully developed or fully realized God? I mean, that seems to mitigate against everything I learned along the way. I mean, that there's a perfection that is both in potentia and in actu together, and there is no room, at least in the divine realm, for any further development in terms of character, which leads yet to another problem in terms of character. But it's a separate issue.
You want to address it, then I'll address it.
You can address it.
Fine. There's no question that there's a component in Orthodox Judaism will reject this. They'll say divine is perfect and immutable. At the same token, there's a big constituency in Orthodoxy, which will say there's room to say that divine is an ongoing perfect potential. So it's a question of, if you want it to be within the realm of Orthodox Jewish dogma, it is. If you want it to be outside the realm of Jewish dogma, it also is.
I understand.
There's room
But
to
isn't there an
maneuver.
inherent contradiction? How can it be an ongoing perfection? If perfection is something realized, and it remains immutable. Your suggestion is that the perfection hasn't yet been totally realized.
You know, it does not say in the Torah God is perfect. It says Torah there is a God. So some Jewish philosophers use the word perfect, which perfect is a loaded word. What does perfect mean? So that's, again, from my perspective, if you want to take the position that God is perfect, and perfect means immutable, then the book is treif. And I'm not worried about that, because Jewish philosophy has a way of coming around to reality where it has to. They discover evolution, all of a sudden Jewish philosophy is on board with evolution, which it wasn't for several thousand years. So Jewish philosophy morphs to reality. If this book turns out to be bona fide and true, then Jewish philosophy, including its right-wing core elements, will morph to it. That's my position.
I'm not 100% sure that this issue really is that stark, because to an extent, we're dealing with things that not only are beyond our knowledge, but beyond our ability to know.
Right.
In essence, what we're saying is the prophetic conundrum, as it was. Does God change his mind? Yet he appears to change his mind. For example, with Saul. I think what it is the potential that Mr. Birnbaum is referring to is pretty much a potential perfection or evolving perfection, insofar it's evolving not necessarily in God, it's him, her, itself, whatever the concept is, but within our understanding, our relationship, our sense of sense of just how the world is together. I put it once in a statement that whereas many years ago God made miracles for us, crossing the Red Sea, for example, nowadays man has to make miracles for himself.
Well, Tim, an interesting point. I think at the bottom, what really I find a bit problematic is that, and it has to be this way, but the gross anthropomorphism of the divine isn't necessarily a part of this kind of a discussion. But to apply these concepts of perfection, of strength, of goodness, and so on, to God, obviously we have no other choice. There's no way we can understand exactly what those concepts mean, or other than to use the Rambam's negative attributes. But I think that's where I find it a bit difficult, because it has to ultimately lead to this kind of a human perception of qualities and traits and characteristics that are really not applicable.
But even the Rambam's negative traits are still, to an extent, anthropomorphic. God is not just.
Right.
Remember that I write this series, I say this series works with or without God. If you're a religious person and you want it to work within a religious context, the God of Israel,
You can.
it works. If you're not a religious person and you want it to work without classic God, it also works. I personally tilt towards a spiritual version of this.
When I found
Right,
it,
right,
as a religious person, I found it to work on a non-spiritual way in the better sense.
Right. But it's not necessary, meaning that's only my personal predilection. The book is written, it works with or without a classic God of Israel or a classic God out there, right? So, you know, this book will certainly not be held hostage to, you know, any right-wing rabbinic who says that God is perfectly immutable. That's your position, and I believe time will pass you by, both in Jewish philosophy and greater philosophy. Let's understand, there's no Jewish philosopher or non-Jewish philosopher whose metaphysics holds water, period. They're all fatally flawed. It's a strong statement. It's paying local Rabbi Tokayer said. There's no one who even comes close. You know, there's a whole industry built around metaphysics and philosophy, but respectfully, they all break down. And I write books which are missing from my children's library. It takes a long time for me to write a book. It's a 30-year endeavor. And this book is missing from my children's library, Unified Metaphysics. I grew up, went to Yeshiva Dov Rebel Forest Hills, I went to Yeshiva University High School, went to CCNY Engineering, went to Harvard Business School, and I went to all the Harvard programs, and I never, always looking for a unified metaphysics. And not one metaphysics came close. And when there's metaphysics that comes close, someone should please enlighten me what it is. So that's where we're at. It's not as if there's an alternative competing metaphysics, Jewish or non-Jewish, which actually works. They're gaping, severe gaping holes. And we can have that's a whole course. What are the gaping holes in these metaphysics? We can go into that.
I'll tell you what the gaping hole is. We're talking theology. What's the Hebrew word for theology? There is none. What do you mean there is none? We invented God, gave God to the world. That's our contribution. What's the word for theology? There is no word. We haven't been talking theology in 5 centuries, 7 centuries, 10 centuries. You know, we've been involved with the Talmud and Halakha and how we live, which is fine. But the subject hasn't been on the table for far too many centuries. We don't even have the lexicon. We don't even have the words to use. And if you want to deal with the issue of the revelation, I mean, is God final or is God not final? One, we don't have the terminology. Well, you do read about it. Berkowitz used to write about it, I think, about evolving revelation. What's evolving there?
Orthodox Berkowitz.
Well, Eliezer Berkowitz.
Who was Orthodox.
Orthodox, right.
Chicago
Yeshiva.
Right.
So, you do have Mechadesh B'chol Yom Tamid Masei Bereshit. I thought creation was finished already, you know, when God went to sleep and then it's over, but it may not be over. So anyway, whatever